Unfortunately, Peter Tosh died in 1987, but I really wonder what he might be thinking or might be doing as the states are suddenly going through this process of legalizing marijuana everywhere. Would it be something that he would be happy about? Or as someone who's made his career off the struggle to legalize marijuana, would he have certain hesitations to having it legalized? Because indeed, he has made a bit of profit off this particular problem. But he's not the only one who we can look at with that same sort of cynical eye. We could consider Barnes & Noble as this really great service for bringing books and media to the masses. So their entire organization was committed to delivering important media. Were they thrilled then when Amazon came along and did it better and indeed has mostly replaced their services? Would they have been interested in perhaps pushing some legislation against the rise of Amazon? And we can look at sort of the cynicism of ambulance services. They're there to pick people up in the worst situations of their life. They've fallen from a tree, they've been in a car accident, and here you have these wonderful services dedicated toward making their lives better. How would Fallon then feel if EMTs or just regular citizens had in their pockets a magical device that solved most of the problems of trauma right there on the location, and then the person who had fallen from the tree could then just hop in a taxi? Well, clearly they might be thrilled about it as an idea, but it wouldn't be very good for their business. So they might not be so excited to see something that eliminates the need for ambulances. And you can take this cynical idea to almost every level, and one of the most famous is this whole idea of war profiteering. Everyone seems to be saying war is hell, and a few folks actually say it with a bit of sarcasm because they indeed profit off the problems at hand. So that said, I want to introduce this wonderful organization that was started in 1970 called Common Cause. And their MO is written right here. The group was created to serve as a citizens' lobby to establish greater transparency and accountability in U.S. political institutions. And remember, the 1970s was this moment of massive transparency initiatives being passed through Congress and elsewhere. So in some ways, they were right in the middle of this wave of transparency. But what I want to ask with respect to Peter Tosh, ambulances, and war profiteering is it appropriate to look at Common Cause and other transparency groups with a bit more cynicism than we've usually given them? In fact, my clickbait title takes us a bit further, and we have to ask ourselves, is this warranted? Is Common Cause or other transparency groups worse than British Petroleum? Are they worse than coal companies? Are they worse than the Koch brothers? Well, what I'm going to suggest here is that transparency organizations have some similarities with oil or coal companies. And that similarity is they need to make payroll, just like the oil and coal companies. The people working for Common Cause make salaries. And if suddenly the things that they are trying to sell no longer has value in the market, so suddenly if oil or coal has no value, well, their salaries go to zero. So they have this huge incentive to make sure that the things they are selling maintain their value. And so if we're looking at Common Cause cynically, the thing they are selling is this problem that there's not enough transparency or accountability in government, and they're going to keep raising funds to establish more and more accountability and transparency. But here's where the problem begins. So here's their current website, the one that you'll find today. And here they say, holding power accountable. Call the White House to demand transparency. Americans deserve open, honest, and accountable government, and we are working to deliver it. So please send us your money because we are doing awesome things. So how is this a problem? Well, as we suggested, the transparency reforms started in the 1960s with the Freedom of Information Act, but that was all executive branch. But in terms of Congress, we're talking this 1970 tsunami of transparency. Okay, so we have the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, and we have the Government and the Sunshine Act of 1976. But then, in 1987, there was this fantastic article written called The Fading Sunshine Reforms. And right at the beginning of the article, they say, the sunshine in government reforms of the early 1970s were fading in the late 1980s. Members were more open, and in this sense, they mean they're more willing to talk about a topic, and markups were more expeditious behind closed doors, according to committee chairman. And so when it came to major legislation, key panels increasingly voted to close the doors. Wow. The committee chairman and the congressmen were all saying, we're finding that when we're behind closed doors, we're doing better work. Well, a lot of folks are going, wow, that's just ridiculous. Those criminals, they want to hide, they want to do all the bribery behind closed doors. But what's interesting is they weren't the only ones that suggested that this might be the case. So here we go deeper into the same 1987 article, and we see this line right here, which has never been cited by anyone anywhere. Representatives of the self-described citizens lobby Common Cause, that's these guys right here, which campaigned for the open meetings rules approved by the House in 1973 and the Senate in 1975 or 76, same bill, so they're lobbying really hard, they're earning their money, these guys, Common Cause, also recognize that closed sessions, particularly in Ways and Means, at times produce legislation less weighted with special interest provisions. Now, they're saying at times because they're just not sure that it's always, but they are hinting that closed-door legislation produce bills that are less weighted with special interest provisions. This is huge. By 1987, the group had stopped monitoring committees to see which were closing meetings and had stopped protesting when they found violations. By 1987, these guys would hear about a closed meeting and they would just stay quiet because they wanted better legislation. The trouble is, Common Cause still had to make payroll. Just like the war profiteers, just like all the other folks. And no one knew this better than Ann McBride. Ann McBride was a Common Cause lobbyist. She was paid by Common Cause, whose express goal was, and still is, providing more transparency in government. That is the product they're selling, just like oil or coal. Or as the war profiteers do, they sell weapons. Common Cause is selling transparency in Congress. If transparency is a problem, they no longer have a reason to exist. And so she was very cautious when she spoke. So here we go again. But, said Ann McBride, a Common Cause lobbyist, we continue to be proponents of openness. Of course you do. Otherwise, you have no job. It's an extraordinarily sad commentary on the power of special interests that members of Congress are now saying we have to operate in secret to hide from the special interests because they are so powerful. But this is the way it always worked. With secret voting inside of Congress, you weren't hiding from the people. In fact, the folks you were most likely to be hiding from were the special interests. And this isn't the only article that expresses this. So here we are in a 1985 Congressional Quarterly article, and look who gets mentioned right away. Common Cause, a self-described public interest group that actually fought to open congressional meetings in the 1970s, is disturbed by the Ways and Means trend and protested when the committee began closing its doors after the new rules were adopted. So remember, we're 2 years before the other article. Okay, so we're starting to see something unusual happening. According to spokesman Randy Hua, again, paid by Common Cause, right? He makes his salary selling transparency. But the group, Common Cause, has lost some of its liberal allies who find they like the kind of tax bills emerging from the back rooms. So Common Cause is losing some friends because there is already this idea that secrecy, secret ballots, are better. Well, we've known that for a long time, and we're starting to really see it here in Congress. So in the mid to late 80s, there was this huge buzz about the problem. So here they talk about an example from 1981 that was the result of all these transparency initiatives. They talk about how the Ways and Means Committee wrote an Economic Recovery Tax Act in public, and the legislation was criticized widely for granting massive tax breaks to the rich and for grossly complicating the tax system. So this is really the first time in 50 years or more when Congress is writing massive tax breaks for the rich, and it's one of the first times that they're talking about tax bills in public. But just a couple of years later, they already got a feeling that transparency might have been a problem. So in 1983 and 1984, the panel privately, in secret, marked up 2 deficit reduction bills that generally have been praised for attempting to close tax loopholes and clamp down on taxpayer cheating. Big change, and this was accomplished because they were done behind closed doors. And so yeah, it's a real dilemma for liberal reformers, says Jeff Drumta, director of the Tax Reform Research Group, an arm of Ralph Nader's Public Citizen Organization, one of the organizations that pushed heavily for transparency. Well, it's not really a dilemma. It just means that those guys might have been wrong. And if they're wrong, it means they also have no jobs. Shh. Time to be very, very cautious about how we spread this news. So let's continue. When you look at recent tax bills, the best ones have come out of closed sessions. This isn't congressmen talking. This is a group. This is Jeff Drumta, who has been a liberal proponent for Ralph Nader's group and a liberal proponent for transparency. So the best ones have come out of closed sessions. Okay, and because they're closed, they don't have any influence. So they're looking pretty foolish. So he says here, you take what you can get and hope someday you can get a good bill at an open meeting. Hope that you can get a good bill at an open meeting, because in closed meetings since 1789, we've been getting lots of great bills. We've been getting Bill of Rights and nearly everything that happened since the 1930s up to the 1970s. These were good pieces of legislation, and almost all of them were crafted in secrecy. So let's continue. Most lobbyists appear to have resigned themselves to being shut out of the committee's deliberations again this year. Lobbyists are being shut out of committees. Well, is that a bad thing? No, that's exactly what we really want. That's how to get campaign finance and money out of politics. In closed meetings, the lobbyists are shut out. Is anyone dropping a tear for them? No, not even the lobbyists themselves. Look at this guy, Harold B. Scoggins Jr., a lobbyist for the Petroleum Association of America, says that while it's frustrating to stand outside the committee room trying to guess what is going on inside, he thinks everyone benefits in the long run. And when he says everyone, he's really talking about the people. And what it might even be suggesting is that companies don't necessarily want to be lobbying. They don't want the world going to hell in a handbag either. But if they don't go to lobby, well, all the other groups go, so they have to lobby. And here he continues. Harold B. Scoggins Jr. says, in a public session, there are so many different interest groups, big money, folks who get paid to sit in on these meetings, eyeballing the congressman, that they're so torn they end up doing something nonsensical. Nonsensical. They end up doing something corrupt or bad or ugly, but certainly bad for the people in general, and certainly starting to favor special interests. So they end up doing something nonsensical. That's how we got where we are, he said. In 1985, he's already suggesting that things have gone bad. And we have gotten there because we have been holding public sessions. This is a lobbyist talking, but remember, he's not the only one. We've got Jeff Drumta and we've got Randy Hua. These are outsider groups that have no reason to say what they're saying. And they agree. Closed doors in Congress, just the way the Constitution was written, are the only way to keep special interests out. And so just as a last word, we have to think about this group, Common Cause, because they have basically admitted that what they are doing might be wrong. And then starting mid to late 80s, they got very quiet about it. They have no longer mentioned that transparency might be the problem. Why? Well, ask the coal companies or the coal states. They really understand how to protect your economic interests by saying things that are full of crap. Transparency organizations are big, big problems.